the issues that matter most to you. Join the conversation. This is News and Views with Rob Snow on News Talk 580 CFRA.
That's the other big story today. The United We Roll convoy for Canada rolled into the nation's capital. It started in Red Deer, Alberta, and they're here to bring attention to what they say is the Trudeau government's lack of support for the energy sector. We have political science professor from the University of Ottawa on the program today, Monica Gattinger. Good afternoon. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. How has it come to this, Professor?
Well, I often think of Canada as being in a slow-motion train wreck when it comes to energy and energy decision-making and broader questions of climate. And I think this is really just a manifestation, the latest manifestation of growing frustration in the West, notably in Alberta, over the desire and interest to get Canada's energy resources to market, notably oil and gas.
Yeah, and those concerns are legitimate, are they not, Professor?
Well, I think it's important to note that, in Alberta there have been substantial cutbacks in the sector. I mean, if you're in downtown Calgary, a lot of office towers are pretty empty. And so there are a lot of folks that are hurting. Their perspective is that they're not being heard in Ottawa, and so they're bringing their concerns to Ottawa.
Yeah. It's not just about pipelines, is it?
No.
It's beyond that, right?
It is absolutely beyond pipelines. I mean, I think, the big question that Canada faces as a country is, what does the future for the country look like when it comes to energy in an age of climate change and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and a whole host of really complex, much broader questions of public policy that we often see being played out in pipelines, but we see them in other energy projects as well, whether it's, large-scale hydro or windmills, a whole host of energy projects that folks can be opposed to.
Yeah, on hydro, we've seen opposition as well to things like the Site C Dam, for example, in British Columbia, right?
That's exactly right. And so many of those projects raise some of these broader questions of public policy. So whether it's, climate change and what does climate action look like for a country like Canada that also happens to have very large energy resources in oil, gas, but also potential in hydro, in renewables, in uranium, nuclear. And also, what does energy development and the future of Canada's energy system look like in an environment of reconciliation with Indigenous communities where there are growing expectations and legal rights, frankly, for the meaningful involvement of Indigenous communities in energy projects?
Okay, so it's about transporting the energy so it can get to export markets. That's one thing, right? It's about the balance between environmental policy by way of, say, a market mechanism, whether that's a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, some kind of price on carbon. But it's also about the environmental review process itself.
I think
there's deep satisfaction not only in Western Canada but also in Atlantic Canada as well over Bill C-69.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with the word balance. That's one of the things that I think Canada has had a hard time, so it's not just the current federal government, but, its predecessors as well, at achieving what I think of as a durable balance. So, what's a workable balance between economic imperatives to get Canada's energy resources to market with environmental imperatives, whether it's climate change or other impacts on the environment, and also security imperatives, right? So not only, access to energy, but also affordability of energy and the like. And what's a workable balance between those, sometimes competing imperatives that's going to stand the test of time. And I don't think, as a country, that Canada has quite gotten that right yet. And a lot of the concerns over Bill C-69 are exactly about that issue.
Okay, so let's get a little bit more into C-69. What is this bill supposed to achieve?
Well, I think it's important to kind of put it a little bit into perspective first. So when the Trudeau government came into power, their energy policy was really articulated around three legs of a stool, is how I think of them. One of which is about getting market access for Canadian energy. The second of which is about, to your point earlier, putting a price on carbon and the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change that they negotiated with the provinces and territories. And then the third leg of that stool was reforming energy decision-making systems to strengthen the public's confidence in those systems. And that's really where Bill C-69 comes into play. So this is a bill that is intended to overhaul the decision-making systems for energy and other projects as well. It also impacts mining and a variety of other sectors to try to address what we're seeing as some of the shortcomings in those systems. So trying to make sure that there was, greater involvement of the public. We know now people want to be involved in decisions that affect them. So greater involvement of the public to try to ensure that, environmental impacts of a variety of different kinds are also taken into consideration appropriately to try to ensure that the involvement of Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge is incorporated into decision making. Because prior to that bill, there was a lot of lack of certainty, predictability, clarity. There was a lot of uncertainty in the environment, not just for investors but for communities as well. And I think where the critiques come on that bill is that it's taken a process that was already, uncertain, quite politicized, and it's actually made it even less certain, less clear, right, and potentially more politicized. So
and it's not. And I should point out, this is not just about pipelines.
No.
Okay. As you say, this is about the natural resources industry in all its facets. For example, successive governments here in the province of Ontario have made big promises about extracting chromite from the Ring of Fire in northern Ontario, where there's a vast mineral wealth there. This could also be of consequence in that process. So where is this legislation now? It's in the Senate, is that right?
So yes, it's in the Senate. So it went through, all of the steps in the House of Commons. It's now made its way to the Senate and is before the appropriate the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Environment. And there's questions there, though. I think pretty open questions about what kinds of changes the Senate might actually be able to make to the legislation, given that it's actually passed through all of the reading stages already in the House of Commons. So there's a lot of open questions there about where that committee is going to take its recommendations and how far they could actually go to make fundamental changes to the bill if they saw fit to do so.
Okay. Finally, we're joined by the way, political science professor at the University of Ottawa, Monica Gattinger. The Prime Minister, when he was running in the 2015 campaign as the Liberal leader, the leader of the third party at the time, spoke much about social license. These projects have to get social license. There has to be buy-in. In other words, there has to be some give and take. There has to be a price on pollution. There has to be buy-in from the Indigenous communities, investment in renewables, and that this entire equation would result in social license. I think a lot of people who are participating in this convoy feel that they've been betrayed by this myth called social license, that it doesn't matter what carbon tax there is or how much investment in renewables or consultations with green organizations or Indigenous organizations, they are just going to forever face opposition to their livelihood. What do you think about it? Is social license real?
Well, I had a research and engagement initiative called Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa, and we've actually looked at these issues really closely. We do not use the term social license because it's not a legal concept. It does not have sort of meaning in the law, and how it's been taken to what it's been taken to mean in the energy sector. It actually originated in mining, but what it's been taken to mean in the energy sector is often, really taking this idea of consent and consensus, to swing the pendulum very, very far out. What we've used instead is the notion of public confidence, that people need to have confidence that the decision-making systems that we have are striking those workable balance points. Because the reality is that there are and can be trade-offs. There are tensions between different energy objectives. And so, in fairness to the Trudeau government, when they came into power, that the three legs of a stool I mentioned earlier, climate, market access, and reforming decision-making, that was kind of the right way to go. But I think what we've seen since that time is, they've ended up having to purchase the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. They've run into challenges with that one on the Federal Court of Appeal decision. We're seeing now at the provincial level a variety of different governments, most recently here the Ford government in Ontario, really pushing back on the carbon pricing scheme. So I think there's a sense in the West, or a sentiment in the West, that the willingness to move on some of these issues has not paid off, that compromise has not paid off. And again, rightly or wrongly, but what we're seeing is a growing level of frustration, and to my mind, that's what the convoy is just the latest manifestation of.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Bye-bye. That's Professor Monica Gattinger from the University of Ottawa.